Would you believe that there are places where a U.S. passport, instead of opening doors, can be a real invitation to trouble? That's right. Despite being one of the most powerful documents in the world, there are destinations that look askance at the arrival of an American, and in some cases, close their doors completely. With the aftermath of the U.S. elections and the adoption of stricter immigration policies, both there and in other countries, the reciprocal has turned out to be true. If the United States makes it difficult and does not want certain nationalities to enter, some governments don't make life easy for American citizens either. The result: heavy bureaucracy in issuing visas, political distrust, and even the possibility of being unceremoniously barred or arrested at immigration. Today, Bello Mundo is going to show you exactly those places where the American passport isn't worth much, and in extreme situations can even be seen as synonymous with enemy number one. After all, the reception still depends a lot on who knocks on the door and where that person comes from. Number 10. Angola. We start the list with a country rich in oil, diamonds, and breathtaking landscapes. Angola has incredible safaris, wild beaches on the Atlantic coast, and a culture that mixes African roots with Lusophone influences. That is, influences from Portuguese-speaking countries like Portugal and Brazil, since Angola was a Portuguese colony until the 20th century. But if you're American, you can forget that idea of landing in a good way. Angola and the United States are not exactly declared enemies. The main problem is bureaucracy. If you have a U.S. passport and want to visit this country, be prepared to face a complex, expensive, and time-consuming visa process, which requires a letter of invitation, official accommodation reservations, and a plethora of bank statements. But this mistrust didn't come out of nowhere. During the Cold War, Angola became an arena for regional disputes, where foreign powers, guess who, directly interfered. Since then, the Angolan government has been wary of Western visitors, especially those from countries that have a long history of meddling in the affairs of others. This means that carrying an American passport can be more of an obstacle than a privilege. In certain regions, corruption and security challenges don't help either, and you can end up feeling like doors are closing rather than opening. It's not outright hostility, but if an American wants to visit Angola, as well as going through all the bureaucracy, they need to be prepared for a few crossed eyes in public offices and an unfriendly infrastructure. Number 9. Turkmenistan. Moving on, we come to one of the most enigmatic countries on the planet. Known as the Hermitage of Central Asia, Turkmenistan is a place that hardly anyone knows where it is, but which hides one mystery after another. This country operates under a strict authoritarian regime and is considered one of the most closed places in the world, practically a version of North Korea in Central Asia. And if you're American, the watchword here is suffocating bureaucracy. Forget simply buying a ticket and getting on board. To enter Turkmenistan, a tourist from the United States must have a letter of invitation approved by the Turkmen government, and getting this is a huge headache. You'll need a local travel agency or an influential contact to take responsibility for you. But even then, the chance of your visa being denied remains high. And if you finally manage to set foot in the country, don't expect to walk around freely. Movement is restricted, there is constant surveillance, and your path can be monitored by the authorities at any time. Now, it's not that Turkmenistan has a declared hatred of Americans, but the country is extremely paranoid about any outside influence, especially Western. Here, media, internet, and communication are tightly controlled, and any idea that appears to be a threat to the regime can be barred before it even enters the territory. The United States, as a great power that defends democracy, is seen by the Turkmen government as a risk to the stability of the regime. The result? American citizens are not exactly welcome here. Number 8. Saudi Arabia. Moving on, we come to Saudi Arabia, a country of scorching deserts, imposing mosques and laws that make any visitor think twice before setting foot there. Despite maintaining strategic alliances with the United States, don't confuse billion-dollar agreements with unrestricted hospitality for American citizens. Until 2019, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia simply didn't grant tourist visas to Westerners, with very rare exceptions for religious pilgrimages to Mecca and Medina, and even then, only for Muslims. Then it decided to open its doors a little wider, but without making things too easy. The visa process is still full of requirements, and entry into the country comes with severe restrictions on behavior. If you like having a beer, walking around freely, and not worrying about dress code, forget it. The consumption of alcohol is forbidden, and the way you dress is monitored at all times. For women, the situation can be even more complicated, as there are specific rules for dress and movement, and any carelessness can result in warnings or even problems with the religious police. But the tense atmosphere goes beyond social rules. Since the September 11th attacks, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States has oscillated between million-dollar agreements and mutual distrust. After all, Saudi citizens were directly involved in the attacks, which led to tensions that have never been completely overcome. What's more, the United States is always involved in conflicts in the Middle East, which means that Americans are viewed with suspicion by the more conservative population. In other words, money from American tourists may be welcome, but don't expect warm smiles and hugs when you arrive. Number 7. Myanmar. Leaving Saudi Arabia, our next stop is Myanmar, a country full of Buddhist temples, stunning landscapes, and a history marked by twists and turns. For years, this destination has enchanted travelers with its ancient buildings and breathtaking scenery, such as the archaeological region of Bagan, where more than 2,000 temples and pagodas sprawl across the horizon. Sunrise over these structures was once considered one of the most fascinating spectacles in Southeast Asia. But that was before. The beauty of the natural scenery is the same, but the political landscape has changed. The military coup of 2021 dragged Myanmar into an endless crisis with violent protests, brutal repression, and serious allegations of human rights violations. The United States strongly condemned the military regime, imposing heavy sanctions. And guess what? The military junta doesn't look kindly on the Americans. For the military government, any foreigner from a country that criticizes its actions can be considered persona non grata, or even a potential spy. There are frequent reports of Western travelers, mainly Americans, being interrogated at the airport, having their visas denied, or even being closely monitored during their stay. For a while, Myanmar was opening up to tourism, but the coup blew it all away. Today, the United States itself recommends that its citizens do not travel there, at the risk of being arbitrarily detained or even caught up in armed clashes. If your dream was to see the sunrise in Bagan, you might want to postpone it indefinitely. Number 6. Syria. Now, we land in Syria, where one of the world's most historic countries has become a scene of destruction and endless war. Before the conflict, Syria attracted thousands of visitors for its UNESCO World Heritage sites, such as the impressive city of Palmyra. Known as the Pearl of the Desert, this was one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire, full of grandiose ruins, imposing columns and temples that seemed untouched by time. But since 2011, Syria has been plunged into a devastating civil war, with extremist groups, bombings, and territorial disputes turning everyday life into pure chaos. The Syrian government sees the United States as one of its main enemies, and the presence of militias, terrorists, and armed groups makes any foreigner, especially an American, an easy target for kidnapping or worse. What's more, the U.S. Embassy in Damascus was closed in 2012, meaning that if anything goes wrong, there's no consular support. Tourism? No way. Although some journalists and aid workers are still able to enter with special visas, this is done at great risk. The country no longer has any tourist infrastructure. Insecurity is absolute, and carrying a U.S. passport, there is like walking around with a giant target on your back. Number 5. Yemen. If there's one place in the world where an American passport can be a huge problem, it's Yemen. The country is experiencing one of the worst humanitarian disaster scenarios on the planet, the result of a devastating civil war that began in 2014 and has brought insurgent groups and foreign forces into constant confrontation. The United States is directly involved in this chaos, with drone operations and support for regional alliances that have already bombed several areas of Yemeni territory. The result? Extremist militias and armed groups see any U.S. citizen as a potential target, whether for kidnapping, reprisals, or simple demonstrations of hatred towards Western influence. The U.S. Embassy in Sana'a closed its doors in 2015, which means zero consular support should anything go wrong. And believe me, the chance of something going wrong there is practically 99%. Laws and order have practically ceased to exist, and the country operates like a war zone with no clear rules. And if anyone still contemplates the idea of trying to get into Yemen, whether for tourism, which already sounds insane, or for humanitarian reasons, they will discover that the logistics of getting there are a complete nightmare. Border blockades, destroyed ports and airports, roads infested with armed groups, and no guarantee of safety anywhere. In a nutshell, Yemen is not just a no-go destination for Americans, but for anyone who values their life. Number 4. Venezuela. Despite being a country of stunning natural beauty, with Caribbean beaches and spectacular waterfalls, Venezuela is experiencing an unprecedented crisis. The country suffers from deteriorating institutions, uncontrolled hyperinflation, and shortages of basic products. And when it comes to the relationship between Caracas and Washington, the climate is one of pure hostility. The governments of the two countries have been exchanging barbs for years, but things have come to a head with heavy sanctions imposed by the United States on the Venezuelan government. What does this mean for American tourists? Being seen as the enemy before they even land. The official rhetoric of the Venezuelan government often points to the United States as the culprit for the country's problems, accusing Washington of trying to destabilize the country. As a result, anyone with a U.S. passport can be treated with extreme suspicion at immigration, undergoing rigorous interrogations, delays, and much greater scrutiny than any other traveler. And it doesn't stop there. Traveling through Venezuela is not easy for anyone, but for Americans the risks are even greater. Kidnappings, muggings, and urban violence are daily concerns, and the lack of consular support makes it even more dangerous. The U.S. Embassy in Caracas hasn't been open since 2019, so if something happens, rescue can be almost impossible. The American website itself gives you an idea of why it's not good to go there. Yes, Venezuela has incredible landscapes such as the Angel Falls, the largest waterfall in the world, but the risk of venturing there can cost much more than just money. Number 3. Russia. We've entered our top 3, and to be honest, there was zero surprise to see Russia on this list. You know that saying, great powers, great friction. Well, nothing sums up the relationship between Russia and the United States better. They were once allies in the Second World War, became deadly rivals in the Cold War, and today live in a relationship of mutual distrust, only with an extra spice: the crisis in Ukraine. Sanctions on one side, reprisals on the other, and in the middle of it all, the American tourist who pays the price. Obtaining a visa for Russia has never been easy, requiring an invitation letter, endless forms, and a questionnaire that seems like an interrogation. But now, with geopolitical tensions at an all-time high, it's even worse. There are reports of visas being denied without justification, absurd delays, and total mistrust on the part of the authorities. And if an American does manage to get in, don't expect to move around freely without feeling the pressure of the state. Monitoring, sudden interrogations, all this can happen at any time. There are cases of American citizens being detained on charges of espionage or breaking local laws, some of them so specific that even a false step can become a serious problem. Add to that a growing nationalist sentiment that doesn't take kindly to the influence of the United States, and there you have it, a climate colder than the Siberian winter. Number 2. Cuba. Our penultimate stop takes us to one of the most controversial destinations for any American citizen, Cuba. The feud between Cuba and the United States has been going on since 1958, when Washington imposed the famous trade embargo, which is still active today. Since then, relations between the two countries have oscillated between attempts at rapprochement and new setbacks. But for American citizens, visiting Cuba is not as simple as it seems. On paper, Americans cannot travel to Cuba for tourism. To enter the country, you have to fall into one of the 12 categories allowed by the U.S. government, such as family visits, journalistic work, or religious activities. Leisure tourism, really? Officially, it's forbidden. But what do Cubans think? In reality, many Cubans love welcoming American tourists. After all, tourism is one of the country's main sources of income. But the Cuban government doesn't make things easy, maintaining strict control over the movement of foreigners and closely monitoring any visitors from the United States for fear of spies and Western influence. Meanwhile, the U.S. government itself imposes restrictions on its citizens, making financial transactions on Cuban soil difficult. In other words, there's no point in carrying an American credit card because it simply won't work there. What's more, if you stay in certain hotels or consume products from companies linked to the Cuban government, you could end up breaking the embargo laws. In short, the country does welcome tourists, but if you're American, it's best to avoid it. Number 1. North Korea. And finally, the absolute do not enter champion. If there's one place in the world where being American means being in real and immediate danger, it's North Korea. Since 2017, the U.S. government has simply banned any tourist travel to the country, following serious incidents involving the detention of American citizens. In other words, with very few exceptions, such as authorized humanitarian missions, a U.S. passport is worth absolutely nothing there. But why so much hostility? The feud between Washington and Pyongyang goes back to the Korean War in the 1950s. For North Korea, the United States is the supreme enemy, and Americans imprisoned in the country have been used as bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations. What's more, the rules for visitors are simply absurd. A tourist can only enter the country under constant surveillance, with an official North Korean government guide attached to them 24 hours a day. Nothing can be photographed without permission, and any slip-up, no matter how minor, can result in immediate arrest. And if someone is arrested, it's a nightmare scenario. Punishments range from brutal forced labor to prison sentences with no release date. And if you think that's an exaggeration, just remember the case of Otto Warmbier. The American student was sentenced to 15 years hard labor simply for stealing a billboard in Pyongyang. After months of no news, he was returned to the United States in a coma and died days later. Bottom line, don't go. If an American passport can open doors in many countries, in North Korea it only opens the door to nightmares. And so we come to the end of our journey through the countries that aren't fans of Americans. You see how an American passport isn't synonymous with being welcome everywhere. Now I want to know, were you surprised? Did you have any idea that places like Turkmenistan or Angola would be so difficult to visit even if they weren't in the headlines for major conflicts? Tell us in the comments and share this ranking with that person who swears that Americans can go anywhere on the planet without any problems. And of course, if you're a fan of international curiosities and like to keep up to date with the most unusual topics, be sure to follow us and subscribe here on Bello Mundo. Thank you very much for joining us and see you on your next adventure.